Hello and a warm welcome, dear D-Trix users. In the third part of the series Variables and Baseline Values, I'd like to explain to you their handling and management in more detail. In this project here, I want to show you exactly where you can define the default values and where you can then use them. Here, at the top level in the project, I can already set preset values. I've defined the ID number here as the default value for the rafters. I've also made changes to the text here. This default value comes from the project. One level down, now in the structure or in the profile, I can reuse the default value that I have defined above. I'll open the profile. As you can see here in the profile, I've defined a default value as well, the rafter height. I've also made it clear from the profile. I have now used this rafter height in the roof surface implementation. We see this here for the thickness of layer 0 and of course in the definition for the rafter. Soon the identification number for the rafter will come from a preset value. Let's take a closer look at this here. This is actually the default value from the project. So, I can still use the profile from the project, the default value here, just one level down, and of course here, the rafter height that I've defined in the profile. Now, let's quickly see how it changes in construction.
That was the view.
Even here in the structure, I've defined a baseline value, namely the rafter width, as we can see here. Of course, I created the roof pitch with the profile we just saw. This means the roof surface design just has the thickness of layer 0 from the default value from the profile. And if I now enter a savings profile, then this one gets the dimensions and also the identification number, determined by the preset values in the project or in the profile. Now, when inserted into the structure, these are fixed values and no longer have any connection to the default values. Now, if I want to enter a rafter that is not from profile, again, up here the ID number is missing from the default value from the project. Is it accessible? Here. For the width, I naturally used the default value that I defined here in the structure. And for the height, since I can't access the default value from the profile here in the structure, I simply use the variable for the thickness of layer 0 and thus arrive at the same result. This means, with this setting here, access various default values and how to get them. This definitely creates a spar with the same ID number as the one from profiles, but with a different width, as it is defined differently here, but the same height. How exactly can I define and determine the default values, and what should I pay attention to? For that, I call the default values function here in the query. We have so far defined only one variable in the structure, which we can see here. To explain everything nicely, I'd like to load a whole variable sentence. We see here, in various areas, some variable sentences are already predefined and are also included for everyone, are available. And here we see, I have saved it myself, the variable sentence from the last tutorial, base plates and wall posts. If I want to add it now, I get a query because I have already defined a variable here in the body. Should this be deleted variably and all new ones loaded? Should variables with the same name exist in both settings? The existing variables should be replaced and the new ones added? Or should I keep the existing ones and just add the new ones? In our case, there are no overlaps here. So whether I choose this button or that one would make no difference. I'll add new here and see. I still have the variable that was defined earlier and everyone included in the statement.
When I click OK, I can see right away in the query what it looks like.
I'm going back to the definition. This column here, constant, I can for every variable set this check mark to define the variable as a constant. That means the suggested value becomes a fixed value and will be adopted if this variable is used later in settings, but this default value here will no longer be queried. It disappears from the query dialog box. If I remove the check mark, it will be queried again. It can be useful if you want to fix a value for now, but keep the option to change it later. Then you can simply fix it at the beginning and maybe remove the hook later. These hooks for external, this means the hierarchy, that is, when which variable is used if several are defined with the same name on different levels. This hierarchy is reversed by setting this check mark, but I want to go into this in more detail later. The variable namer must start with a v to clearly mark the variable as a user variable and prevent any confusion with other variables. And the variable name must not contain any spaces or special characters. Somewhat inconvenient would be if the variable name begins with v underscore. For the following reason, I can also call individual variables here, and not just a whole sentence, but individual variables. We see here we have the compilations too, and here individual variables. We see here already the variables have all start with v underscore. This means when the user variables that the user can define themselves, there could also be confusion at the beginning. I'll take this value here and add it in. And we see it starts with an underscore v. The variables in the query. This text here and the suggested value, these are the things that will appear later in the query for the preset. The unit, most of these units, such as torments, length units or degrees, are self-explanatory. However, there is a special feature here, for instance, with the identification numbers. Namely, this identification number is only for fasteners. The identification number OP, which means without profile, takes you via the measure button into the component catalog, and the identification numbers that have a profile description are filtered out. And this identification number B for component, through this unit one can get all identification numbers from the component catalog, including those with profile descriptions. They are selected here for purlins and for the wall components. If there are still questions about the units here, and there is still a need for explanation, I would like to point out a document at this point that comes with the installation DVD. And in this document are all units clearly explained and described. Down here, this button, Variables Definition, takes us into a slightly more detailed dialog box. For instance, I can enter a variable description here. A poor choice of example. Let's go with this one. And this description text that
appears in both the query and the negotiation.
Show up later in the formula editor, just like this auxiliary image. For the auxiliary images, a large one is already... We see this in the installation folder, in the ABB subfolder, and in the image collection, also sorted according to these topics. And there is already a variety available, meaning you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel, but of course you can save a screenshot or similar as an image file and call it up at this point here, and then it will be both in the variable query and later in the formula editor are displayed. These two arrows here mean I can move the variable I'm standing on here up or down, and of course I can also delete variables. The one we just inserted, for example. This way it disappears and I can see the things here, sort them as I need, and after sorting they naturally appear in the query dialog box. If I now proceed with my compilation here, I'm satisfied with it and don't want to change anything. Of course, again under here this selection available, and you can recall it at any time in other structures. And at every point where one can define default values. Here we have another point. That's the variable group. I'd like to briefly show this in this example. I can assign each variable to a group of variables. This gives me a somewhat clearer presentation. I'll show that briefly. Here are the additions, first the sill plates and then the wall posts. This means I'm setting up these names. Wall posts, and then I have access here via this drop-down arrow. That means I'll choose the group footplates everywhere for this first group here. Of course, if I haven't already defined the variable, as in this case, but am in the process of assembling it, I can also select the variable group here in this variable definition. But since they are already so well defined here, I just want to quickly go through and add these groups. Again, wall posts, and here's the last one. I deliberately did not choose a group up here. If I now click on OK, I immediately see that the appearance here is completely different. I have received buttons for the assigned groups up here. And there I was, variables, namely the first not assigned to a grouping, automatically created a general button. In it, everyone who doesn't have a group assignment would be included. And here we have everyone to whom I've assigned the group foot soldiers, and over here for the band positions. With this relatively small variable rate, the effect here isn't so incredibly huge, but when we look at an example, load a large variable set. I'm accessing something here again that has already been provided. I now want to remove all existing ones and only load the new ones, and we see when a lot of variables are defined, just for the savings group, there are so many that a scroll bar appears. Of course, it makes sense to group this to keep it organized. So much for the precise definition of the variables. As mentioned earlier, I can always adjust the set of variables accordingly. Save under a new name, and I can access the saved ones here via the management. Either group or rename here, or delete some, of course, or I can do this here. As known from all settings in the program about data exchange over a network, for example, share with a colleague to other computers or place on a server, or send it as an email to a colleague if I want him to work with the same calibration set. So much for the definition. For handling and managing these variables, I now want to delve a bit deeper into the point I mentioned earlier, the hierarchy. What exactly is behind the external hook? Right. For this, I switch to the project management. What happens now if I define a default value in the project, meaning at the highest level, and define a default value with the same name, with the same variable names in the structure? And I can also define variables for HRB runs, for and var symbols. And if I give the variables the same name here, then the question arises: which variable is ultimately used in the HRB, in the combination element, or in the dot symbol? The normal hierarchy is such that the last place where a value was defined is what matters. This means, for example, if I define something in the halfway area. If I define a variable with the same name that already exists up top, it will be used. I now want to show what happens when I change the variable, when I define it as external. For that, I'll go into the default values of the project here and save it with this default value.
Just check the ID number. Okay.
Now I'm going back to the bar back. Go back to the default values here and call up the value I just saved. We see here the ID number and say, just add the new one. Okay. I have here exactly the same default value as I defined it in the project. The name is the same, that's crucial. I can also mention the help text under the image here from the structure. And it is still, because I have not changed the name, the same variable. Here I take C24 again, and I'm not ticking this box for external, but leaving the value defined as is. And that means, if I now want to enter a rafter, I receive the identification number C24, because the variable that is being used here, I just changed it.
We see a building here.
When I am now in the variable definition, this value define external, then the value is red. You see, I cannot access it here, I cannot change the value here. And it is read from a level higher from the project. Here we see it in application. I've used KVH again here since the value comes from the project. If I've defined the value like this as external, but at the point where it is searched, no value with this name is present. I'll go back to the project again, and here I'm just deleting the value
by saying no setting.
That means in the level mentioned above,
He's gone.
Then the default value from the structure comes here and I can access it again, although he is still defined as external. What is now
The big
the
advantage we have from
option
this
to define individual values as external?
is offer.
For example, in a large project with multiple construction positions, I can create all positions with the same set of default values, but then have the option to control individual values across the entire project. These values will
simply determined at a higher level, namely at the top of the project, and so I
the
can
values I selected are definitely defined the same in all structures or just in selected ones. I hope I was able to show you how exactly default values are created and how to handle them. I want to emphasize again that there are already a multitude of variables and also of sets of variables available and included, and you can help yourself to it as you please, to thereby individually assemble the setting that makes the work easier and thus also saves time. Thank you as always for watching. See you next time.